Carrie is one of the most important works of horror fiction of all time. It, along with the film adaptation 2 years later, was so monumental in forming the public image of Stephen King, and the explosion of horror that came in the next decade, that to call it a trendsetter would be a great disservice, and an understatement. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas, which also both released in 1974, are often attributed as the first major steps in the horizon of a new dawn within the genre. But I think Carrie, which released 7 months earlier than Chainsaw, should be given more its due in that conversation. It tells the story of Carrie White, a girl who is the personification of the word unpopular. She's not pretty. She does not come from money. She wears old clothes, and her mother is dangerously crazy and religious. She is an unfortunate girl who has her first period very late and very publicly near the end of high school in the shower, after her PE class. She's hazed by her fellow students. Most of them are girls who are pretty, more popular, and well-liked, who, as a punishment for all of this, are told that they will no longer be allowed to go to their senior prom later on that year. Carrie is obviously devastated by what has happened to her, but the thing that makes Carrie different from most girls is that Carrie secretly has the ability to move things with her mind. One of the girls, Sue Snell, who hazed Carrie, feels bad and regrets her actions. She asks her boyfriend Tommy, who's one of the most popular boys in the school, to take Carrie to the prom and show her a night that she would otherwise never be permitted to experience. Reluctantly, Tommy agrees, but unbeknownst to them, the other girls have formed a plot. One of revenge to rig the prom queen and king election system, to have Carrie win the prom queen, to trick her into climbing up those stairs, to collect her award, wherein they will pull a rope dropping a bucket of pig's blood onto her head, and well, you know the rest. There will never be another Stephen King. He's a creation of a time period in more ways than one. With the advent of the internet, those particular conditions will never again allow a single horror author to reach the monolithic cultural status that he had possessed for over 4 decades. Almost every single person on the planet knows who Stephen King is, and a good majority of them have read one of his books, or at the very least seen an adaptation of his work. He's a living storyteller who has reached billions of people with his words, and without Carrie, none of that probably would have ever happened. Without Carrie, our entire world would look different. No King means that the horror boom of the 80s would have been diminished, or maybe would not have happened at all, and everything inspired by his work would similarly have never existed. We probably would not have Clive Barker, Sam Raimi, or countless others. And in that same line of thinking, Stephen King himself probably would not have been Stephen King if it weren't for a trashy newsstand article, a few sad people that he knew along the way of his journey, and the inquisitive nature of his wife. And that's not an exaggeration. In 1999, King wrote the following about what led to the creation of this novel. Now, this quote will be long. I'm going to edit it a bit where I can just for the sake of timing, but I think it is really important to include here, because it is the story of where Carrie originated for King in his own words, both thematically with what was going on in his mind, but also situationally, with everything that was going on with his life. Carrie's a real crossroads moment, both for King and for culture at large. So, what follows is essentially his pop writing origin story, and what happened here legitimately shaped the landscape of future horror media and culture in incalculable ways. In the very late fall or early winter of 1972, I had an idea for a short story about a girl with telekinetic powers. The idea had actually been kicking around in my head since high school, when I read a Life magazine article about a case of poltergeist activity in a suburban home. The activity in the house seemed, on closer examination, to have nothing to do with ghosts. There was a troubled teenage girl in the family. When she was home, objects, particularly religious objects, flew through the air. When she was away, things stayed where they belonged. The article hazarded the theory that much of the activity ascribed to ghosts is actually caused by kids, and that girls on the brink of puberty seem especially apt to tap into this wild talent. The idea seemed to be that there was a great force within them, accessible only at this time of their life. I thought it would make a good story, maybe worth as much as $500, and started to write it, working in the laundry room of our little trailer. I typed the first draft single-spaced with extra narrow margins, as I always did, Paper cost money, and we had none to waste on extra sheets for first drafts. Before I had completed 2 pages, ghosts of my own began to intrude. The ghosts of 2 girls, both dead, who eventually combined to become Carrie White. I will not call either by her true name here. They were unfortunates in life, and do not deserve to be chewed over in death. I will call one of them Tina White, the other Sandra Irving. Tina went to elementary school with me. She was pudgy and quiet, so backroad you could cry. There is a goat in every class, the kid who's always left without a chair in musical chairs, the one who winds up wearing the "kick me hard" sign, the one who stands at the end of the pecking order. This was Tina. Not because she was stupid, she wasn't, and not because her family was peculiar, it was, but because she wore the same old clothes to school every single day. I can still see that outfit. I don't even need to close my eyes. After Christmas one year, Tina came in wearing an entirely new outfit. I can't remember that one, only how happy she was to be wearing it. I can clearly remember how her hopeful vivacity changed, first into surprise, then into anger, and finally into dull acceptance, as the teasing and the insults and the sarcastic comments rained down on her. Instead of abating, the kids' rejection of Tina became even fiercer. I did not take part in this behavior, but I didn't speak against it. Hell, I was only 14 years old. It's hard to stand up when you're 14. Sandra Irving lived about 1.5 miles from the little house where I grew up. There was no father in the picture, only her mother, and a large German shepherd with an absurd name of Cheddar Cheese. Mrs. Irving hired me one day to help her move some furniture. I might have been 16 or so by then. I was struck by the crucifix hanging in the living room, over the Irving couch. If such a gigantic icon had fallen where the two were watching TV, the person it fell on would almost certainly have been killed. I had always known that the Irvings were religious, in some queer and fervent way that excluded out-of-the-mill Methodist church. But until I saw that hideous, dominating Christo, the impaled figure on the cross running blood and freshets from the hands and feet and side, eyes upturned in a grisly combination of agony and compassion, I've never fully understood how religious, or how strange. That religion was part of what kept kids from Sandy. The smell of her, not dirt but some strange powdery scent, like sweet and cloying library dust, was also a part of it. The fact that she suffered from epileptic seizures, and wore strangely modest, old-fashioned clothes, also played their parts. But as with Tina, there was something else as well, something that broadcast strange, not like us, keep away, on a wavelength only other kids can pick up. Neither girl, fortunately or unfortunately, had Carrie White's wild talent. Neither made it through high school, nor saw the age of 30. Tina committed suicide, hanging herself in her cellar. Sandy died during an epileptic seizure in the small apartment she'd taken in the town where we'd all gone to high school. These were the ghosts which kept trying to come between me and what I was writing, kept insisting that I combine them, somehow into a story that would tell what could have happened if there really was such thing as telekinetic energy. What could have happened if the world was as fair to young girls as it is hard. In short, they wanted me to write a novel. I was frightened, both of the world of girls I would have to inhabit, and the level of cruelty I would have to describe. I was also frightened to revisit what I had not the wit or moral courage to stop. And there's a more prosaic side as well. Tabby and I needed some quick money for groceries and rent, not a novel that might not sell to a publisher. I threw the half-completed first pages of the story into the wastebasket and went down into the living room to watch TV. Tabby asked me what I'd been working on. I told her a short story, but I had gone bust and that I threw it away. Perhaps she saw something in my face. I don't know for sure. All I know is that she went into my little writing room, took the pages out of the wastebasket, shook off the cigarette ashes, smoothed them out, and read them, and suggested that I go on. I did, mostly to please her. This drawing sympathy and inspiration from real-life events is taken further, as even though this is never really talked about, King himself is a minor character in the text of the novel that impacts Carrie's life. as she looks back and remembers that the only teacher she ever had that was nice to her was her 7th grade English teacher, named Mr. King. A very small detail about the importance of how a single act of kindness is so easy to give, and may seem insignificant to the giver, but could be remembered for years by the receiver of that kindness. And how, so often, for a kid like this, a teacher going out of their way to smile at them, or to ask them how their day is going, can make all the difference. Carrie's a story about blood, about the neurotic trauma passed down from parent to child, both in inherited traits as well as how we are raised. It is a story about nature and nurture, about how we are the way we are because of the environments created and fostered by our parents. It deals in this metaphorical blood, this family connection, to our parents, and the curse or blessing that we are all in our own ways, destined to in part at least eventually become just like they are, no matter how hard we fight that. Both in biological past gene traits, as well as conditions under which we are raised. It is an important part of that story. I think the fact that Carrie gets her traits from her father, who is also a telekinetic person, ties into that. But it is also about literal blood. Menstrual blood has always been a symbolic storytelling device, to represent the bridge between childhood and adulthood, both within fiction as well as the world that we live in. It transposes a certain power over others. The fantastic visual masterpiece, Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, starts with Valerie as a child, walking through a field only to notice that she's leaving drops of scarlet on the white flowers that she passes. And then in the days to come, finds herself subsequently the center of sexual attention that borders on a desire to consume her entirely by the older vampiric men and women of her village. Men who once paid her no mind. In The Love Witch, a love potion is made from her blood. Ginger Snaps uses the monster of the werewolf to explore menstruation. It is parodied, specifically related to Carrie, in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. Bloodborne has a queen who retains her power through her own blood magic that is inferred to be tied to her monthly cycle. In Bioshock Infinite, Elizabeth's powers come to her fully with her first menstruation, which is also probably a reference to Carrie. Now this is almost always exclusively a storytelling device used by men, and that should be examined too, but there is something there that really started, at least within pop culture with King, and sort of birthed its own subgenre, so to speak. Even though it is his first published novel, there's so many elements at play here that would become common recurring style motifs. From the very beginning, he tells us how this is all going to end. We know the climax from the first pages. We aren't compelled by wanting to know what happens next, but instead, how it affects these characters, and how they emotionally get to a point where all of this goes down. King sets up the central theme of the novel with one of his first lines, that he writes when Carrie's taking her fateful shower, after PE. She looked the part of the sacrificial goat. Soon after he says, her eyes rolled with wet whiteness, like the eyes of a hog in the slaughtering pen. This is the general idea at play here, that Carrie being led up to the stage under false pretenses is no different to the treatment that cows get in the pen. That the treatment of the bullies is dehumanizing to an unimaginable degree. The only ally that Carrie really has on her side throughout the narrative, aside from her half-friend of Sue Snell, is the PE teacher of the school, Miss Desjardins. King writes her in such a way as to imply that she may have been a Carrie when she was younger, and that the sympathy that she feels for her might be rooted in a shared upbringing. She's described as their slim, non-breasted gym teacher, and her legs not too curved but striking in their unobtrusive masculinity. But she too is not innocent entirely in all of this. Despite Carrie's panic attack early in the novel, it says, she slapped Carrie smartly across the face. She hardly would have admitted the pleasure the act gave her, and she certainly would have denied that she regarded Carrie as a fat, whiny bag of lard. Carrie becomes this vehicle in the story to project any aggression onto, because she's deemed as less than human, and through that, to be undeserving of love and compassion. Even the ones being nice to her are doing so out of a societal urge to do what others would expect of them, rather than for the sake of simply doing it. There is no such thing as true love given to the Carries of the world. because they're viewed as lesser for how they look and the backgrounds that they come from. Carrie is a cruel story. The characters obviously have contempt for her just for existing. But to an extent, at least at the beginning of the novel, so does King, and the narrator that he writes. He has fully admitted that he even saw Carrie as unlikable and pathetic when he started writing the book, and that it took a great deal of time before he could empathize with her, which is present and can be felt on the page. What follows are just some of the quotes from the book describing Carrie, almost all of them being based on animalistic characteristics, of how the omniscient narrator of the story sees the subject. A frog among swans, pimples on her neck and buttocks. She just looked so dumb standing there, not knowing what was going on. She looked like a patient ox, aware that the joke was on her, dumbly embarrassed but unsurprised. She looked around bovinely, slumped over, breast pointing to the floor, her arms dangling limply. She looked like an ape. Her eyes were shiny and blank. She could only crawl into the living room with her hair hanging in her face, braying huge, hoarse sobs. Carrie, as a girl, certainly experiences dysmorphia throughout the story, and is largely the inciting internal conflict that explodes at the end of the novel. You know, they say that psychologically people often take their own lives because of external pressures weighing on them, and that others commit mass violence because of internal pressures exploding outward. And I don't know how much stock I really take in all of that. But the idea is kind of what is at play here. She especially feels this when she compares herself to the girls around her. She avoids mirrors in her house because she can't stand to see the way that she looks. In one of the most famous scenes, she breaks a mirror out of anguish of not looking like how she sees herself in her mind. At one point, the text says, she hated her face, her dull, stupid, bovine face, the vapid eyes, the red, shiny pimples, the nests of blackheads. She hated her face most of all. The novel also largely functions as a damnation of the type of parent that Margaret White is symbolic of. She inflicts her religious views so fervently that it crosses from upbringing into the territory of abuse. Margaret has failed in her duties as a mother, in raising Carrie, to be prepared for what the world has in store for her. In one of the more tragic present-day sections of the novel, that takes place sometime in the mid-80s, a woman named Stella Horan is being interviewed by the FBI about her connection to the events of the story. You see, she lived beside the Whites as a child, and tells the agent, she was such a pretty girl. I've seen some high school pictures of her, and that horrible, fuzzy black and white photo on the cover of Newsweek. I look at them and all I can think is, dear God, where did she go? What did that woman do to her? Oh, she was so pretty. You'd never know it from those pictures. This section is also used to build the metaphor for other types of spree and serial killers, who show red flags that go ignored as children, who then grow up into adults that hurt other people. Carrie brings down a hailstorm onto her house as a young girl, and this is merely written off. Horn tells the FBI. And then there's this other thing. No one can laugh that off either. Too many people are dead, and it's not just on the Whites' property anymore. One detail that is essentially omitted from all the adaptations is the story of Carrie's birth, which mirrors the moment of her developing her powers later on in life, that I think is quite interesting. After being impregnated by Ralph White, Margaret was raised so religiously and sheltered that she believes she is being punished for her sins, and has been inflicted with a cancer of her womanly parts. She does not go to the hospital, choosing to die alone in her house because of her sins. Not a single neighbor on her street calls the police after hearing her screams, and she gives birth to Carrie right there in her bedroom by herself, and always views her daughter from that point as a cross that God has given her to bear, mirroring what her daughter some years later would experience in the shower. This lack of education on blunt, embarrassing, yet necessary things about life leads to these traumatic events. It says that sheltering your children does nothing good for them. And with this, I think it's safe to say that we can transition into talking about the films now, as a continued discussion about the base story of Carrie will continue throughout each of these adaptations. But before we do that, as a final thought, I do have one question about this book that has bothered me for almost 2 decades, since the first time that I read it. And if you know the answer to this, then please tell me in the comments, because I've never heard anyone talk about this and it's always bothered me. For some reason, King wrote Carrie to take place in the future, and I would love to know why some may think that is. It isn't even the far future, as the novel was published in 1974, but takes place in 1979. It seems so arbitrary, but it's such a small detail that is easily missed and sticks out to me, as this has to be done for a deliberate reason, but I can't think of any narrative function that would serve. So genuinely, let me know if you have a theory. Carrie is an interesting franchise to examine that sits squarely with few other classics like Frankenstein and Dracula, where it exists over many decades, but every iteration of it is basically adapting the same story over and over again, for a new, modern audience. Instead of having, an endless stream of sequels and reboots, we've essentially gotten a Carrie adaptation every single decade since it was released, but each of them differ in small ways in how they are presented, based on the cultural aesthetics and values of where horror was in those eras. And so that makes it a bit of a different kind of franchise video compared to what I usually cover. But to me, that's what makes Carrie a bit fascinating, is how it differs from the usual affair in the landscape of modern horror. Now, I know a moment ago that I said that Stephen King would not have reached the level that he achieved as an author and figure if it had not been for Carrie. And that is true. But what is probably a bit more true is that he would not have achieved that status if it were not for the 1976 adaptation of his novel. Brian De Palma, who directed the film based on Lawrence Cohen's script, who would go on to write 3 out of the 5 entries in this franchise, had technically been making movies for almost 20 years at this point. But De Palma certainly had never reached anything close to what would be considered mainstream status, or really even just plain success at all, and if we're being honest with ourselves, consistent quality. While it is considered a classic today and is a film that I love, his 1974 work, Phantom of the Paradise, was poorly received at the time, has its rough moments, and was not a commercial hit. And the closest thing to real success that he had before this point was Obsession, which released earlier in 1976 after the production of Carrie was already completed. While having the experience, De Palma only really had a track record for creative financial flops, and financing a movie made by him based on an unknown author's first published book could have gone either way, and on paper was probably a bad business move. So to mitigate this, compared to other horror novel adaptation films of its time, like Jaws, which was made for $9 million, or The Exorcist with $12 million, The Sentinel with $3.5 million, Salem's Lot for $4 million, or Ghost Story for $13.5 million, Carrie was working with a substantially smaller budget than what would be considered normal for a production this size, with only $1.8 million to produce this with, which, within that context, makes what they were able to achieve on this all the more impressive. But there are things that are cut from the novel for budgetary reasons. The FBI frame story, Carrie destroying the entire town on her path of rage, the rain of stones that fall on the White House, all are not featured in this adaptation, which is fine. The film is a masterpiece, and any of those additions would not have made this particularly better to any noticeable degree, and in fact may have harmed the film. The producers of this were apparently so scared that they had another De Palma flop on their hands, that they demanded that the film be retitled to the more cliché Pray for Carrie, to try and signal to the audience that this would be a scary B-level drive-in movie that they should go see. De Palma refused and fought back against this, and the original title was eventually what went with the finished film. They did have to take some extreme measures though to pull this off with the limited amount of money that they had. For instance, to keep the blood on Carrie consistent throughout the entire final act of the film, they shot all of these scenes within as close window of time as possible, but it did take multiple days, 4 of them to be exact. In that time, to make sure that they had the proper continuity, Sissy Spacek was not allowed to shower, and had to even sleep at night flat on her back with the blood on her to make sure that the stains were in the same place the next day, and did not look different from scene to scene. In the morning, they would have to lightly spray mist on her with a water bottle, to loosen up the fake blood enough that would have dried to the point of making her stuck to herself in the bed. For the last scene of the film, they also did bury Spacek under this giant pile of rocks, and that was her real actual hand reaching up out of the ground. This on-the-fly, extremely low-budget filmmaking is also why the ending feels the way that it does. It works in a very surreal sense, but logically when you think about it, what's going on here doesn't quite add up. The original intention of this scene was to have Carrie bring rocks down from the sky onto the home to destroy it. They had already filmed the interior shots of this sequence, so when Carrie is destroying the house right after killing her mother, the ceiling starts to cave in with these giant rocks, but outside there's no rocks falling. This is because the device that they had to drop the rocks malfunctioned on the night of shooting, and they tried to fix it but they couldn't get it to work. The sun was about to come up and they were going to lose the night, and so in a moment of desperation, De Palma told them to just burn the house down and film it collapsing, and they would make it work in the edit. And surprisingly, everything not only turned out alright, but also became one of the most well-known sequences of the 1970s. It is pretty fair to say that the success of the 1976 adaptation of Carrie gave both De Palma and King their careers. But not only that, it also gave breakout performances to Sissy Spacek, Betty Buckley, Amy Irving, John Travolta, and Nancy Allen. When being interviewed at the time of the film's release, De Palma said the following about the early stages of production and why he wanted to make this film. "I read the book. It was suggested to me by a writer friend of mine. A writer friend of his, Stephen King, had written it. I guess this was almost 2 years ago in 1975. I liked it a lot, and proceeded to call my agent to find out who owned it. I found out that nobody had bought it yet. A lot of studios were considering it, so I called around to some of the people I knew, and said it was a terrific book, and I'm very interested in doing it. Then nothing happened for, I guess, 6 months. One of the ways that they saved money in this pre-production phase was essentially everyone who worked on this had either worked with De Palma before, or were friends with him. De Palma already knew Sissy Spacek, because he'd hired her to be the set designer on Phantom of the Paradise, and eventually gave her the role. The same could be said of Betty Buckley, who had worked on the technical end of a number of De Palma films. In this process, though, another thing that they did to save money was that De Palma and his close friend George Lucas held the joint casting sessions for this and Star Wars at the same time in the same room, where women would come in and read for both Carrie and Princess Leia in one audition. Amy Irving, who plays Sue Snell in the film, was reportedly Lucas's first choice to play Leia, but De Palma snatched her for Carrie instead, which, as a performer, probably seemed like the right move at the time, but I bet she went on to really regret that decision. Piper Laurie had at this point been retired for 15 years. Her short career lasting from 1950's Louisa to 1961's The Hustler ended with her reaching a peak of being nominated for Best Actress at that year's Academy Awards. She met, while doing press at the time of that film, critic Joe Morgenstern, and when no substantial roles had been offered to her after the Best Actress nomination, she decided to go out on a high point. She married Morgenstern, retired at the age of 29, and the two relocated to Woodstock, New York. She was the only person that De Palma wanted for Margaret White, but she turned down the part in Carrie multiple times, only finally accepting it when De Palma flew out to her house personally to essentially beg her to take the role. This would gain her another Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress, and re-sparked her love of performing, where she would continue to appear in films and on television, including memorable performances in Twin Peaks, as well as Return to Oz. On up until the pandemic, where it seems as if she has retired again. You know, one of the reasons that I started making franchise videos in the first place was because there are some movies in horror that feel like they are so big. They have to be covered if you're going to be attempting to make a series of comprehensive essays about the history of the genre, but have historically been talked about to such a degree that there's not a ton new to really say about them in doing a review. I started talking about franchises because it allowed me to talk about these classics in a way that they otherwise might not be, through being recontextualized by their sequels. There's literally nothing new that I could say to you about A Nightmare on Elm Street that wasn't more eloquently said by someone else 20 years before me, but I might be able to say something about the work by looking at it through a lens of the sequels that spawned from it and its legacy. And in that light, what is there to actually say about Carrie 1976, other than it is a fantastic film, being both one of the best of the 1970s and the best in horror cinema, period. The stylistic decisions that De Palma would become renowned for, which were a bit rudimentary in his earlier work, is implemented to perfection here. the split-screen format that he would use in this, which would even end up being displayed on the poster, gives the film such a unique feeling in the editing and presentation that it still feels new, unique, and dangerous. From the moment that Carrie steps onto the stage and begins the climax, all the way to the grave sequence and the end credits, every shot contained there has been cemented in people's minds and the memory of the culture. I would wager that people who saw this when they were younger remember details of the final act of that movie more than just about any other. There's just a tactile quality to the way that it was done that stays with you. Something that is interesting to me about this is that this isn't how it was done in the book. Carrie, drenched in blood, starts to cry and run outside, and only then, when she is by herself in the parking lot, does she decide to use her powers to lock the gym doors and burn the building down. But having her stand on the stage, displayed in what they have done to her, using her powers up front to enact her vengeance, is not only the more visually interesting option, but also thematically much more satisfying. This movement with her eyes, directing her powers, is so iconic that every single adaptation would rip it off instead of actually doing how the book describes it. Despite there being 5 entries in the Carrie franchise, the ending of the novel has never actually been adapted, which honestly is probably for the best. It also codified how these kinds of powers would look on screen for pretty much the rest of time. Not just for Carrie, but for other cinematic telepaths as well. On her iconic performance as Carrie, Spacek has a similar story to King on the direction where she took the part, based around a girl that she knew growing up. She was from a poor family, and wore weird clothes. But she was really beautiful. People made fun of her, but not as much as they did of Carrie. Dorothy filled the space in my class that Carrie did in hers, and I based a lot of the character on her. As an adaptation of the novel, one of my only major criticisms of this movie would be that, while Spacek is iconic in the role and absolutely kills this performance, she would be so real and memorable in this that it would result in the unintended effect of us never receiving a book-accurate Carrie in any subsequent adaptation. Every updated movie's Carrie since this is cast to be reminiscent of Spacek, instead of being how she is in the novel, where Carrie is constantly described as being severely overweight. And while Spacek was kind of perfect in her own way for the direction they were going for here, with some of the most visceral facial acting to ever be captured in a movie, I would have loved for at least one of these later works to be daring enough to deviate in what we as an audience think an adaptation of Carrie can be. If they were to ever take the franchise forward, that would be a strong direction to go after. But aside from that, it is essentially a perfect adaptation and representation of this novel put to screen. And honestly should have been the end of this video, as nothing else was needed here. This shouldn't have ever been a franchise, but they did in fact keep making these, starting with the 1980s Broadway adaptation. But before we move on to that, there's something that I'd like to talk with you, if you don't mind. The unfortunate thing about being a YouTuber like myself that focuses on horror media is that often it is the case that videos I spent 1 to 2 months on get demonetized soon after they are released and can no longer generate revenue even when they're viewed. This is the case even with videos you might not expect. My Nicolas Cage video, my H.P. Lovecraft video, my Homunculus video, my History of Horror Comics video, both of my Evil Within videos, all have been restricted, despite the fact that they are viewed fairly often and still recommended by YouTube. Some of the things that I am most proud of to have made are no longer considered suitable for advertisers on this platform. I also in recent months have not been recommended like I once was, further hurting my ability to continue to do this full time. This channel and what I do here could not be possible in any other way without your support on Patreon. Making these videos is a full-time job for me, and I genuinely need help from viewers like you to make it sustainable for the long road ahead. I want to be doing this for many, many years to come if possible, and without the support of viewers on Patreon, none of this could be a reality. These videos would simply no longer be able to be made. I love making videos. This is my favorite thing that I have ever had the chance to do, and I would just like to ask that if you like my work, please at least consider donating. For just $1 a month, you could help ensure that I could continue to do this indefinitely. Thank you again so much for everything, really. From watching my work and telling others about it, to supporting me on Patreon or in any other way that you do. Even if it's just down to saying that you like something that I made. It's all added up to the last few years being a very interesting experience that I would never have traded for anything. So thank you so much. And now back to Carrie, the musical. I think this musical's fun. Far from the best that I've ever seen, but it has its merits in the history of Carrie. And horror, as one of the few times that a franchise has branched out into theater at all, let alone being done on Broadway. It also has a unique history as it closed after only 16 previews and 5 regular performances, which to my understanding just doesn't happen for major shows in modern times, making it one of the shortest-lived productions in Broadway history. Now, while I do like theater quite a lot, I don't have the background required to talk about this in any way that would be actually worth your time, in my opinion. I've never really done this before, but honestly, after you finish watching this video, you should just go and watch Wait in the Wings video on Carrie the Musical, and mentally insert that information at this part. They do a full hour plus breakdown of what went down here, and it's fantastic and really worth a watch, and just does a much better job explaining that situation than I could here. And before we move on from the subject, one quick thing that I do find funny about this is that Margaret was played by Betty Buckley in that fateful production in 1988, who also played Miss Desjardins in the 1976 film a decade previously. The spring of 1999 saw the arrival of The Rage, Carrie 2, which started out with not really actually being a Carrie movie at all, but here we are. The film was originally written in 1995 as an original paranormal revenge story called The Curse, based on the 1993 Spur Posse incident, where a group of high school boys in Lakewood, California, started a competitive game where a point-based system was used to compare their sexual exploits, that continually escalated into exceedingly more violent sexual crimes. Studio executives read the script, realized that it was extremely derivative of Carrie, and instead of rejecting it, they bought it, and decided to greenlight it into a film after a rewrite, as an outright sequel to Carrie. The project was shot under the awful title of Carrie 2, Say You're Sorry, before being changed for some reason to the even worse title of The Rage, Carrie 2, before its release on March the 12th of 1999. This follows Rachel, a Carrie-like girl who is a misfit within her school, who gets wrapped up in this game that the boys are playing, who eventually suffers a supreme public embarrassment, and takes her pain and turns it into a full-blown massacre of rage that takes out not only these boys, but also pretty much everyone in her high school. So, how is this sequel that only features one actor from the original film, spliced with archival footage that connects the two projects? It's actually at times pretty good. I have a fondness for that specific period of highly polished studio filmmaking, both in and out of horror. Movies like Stir of Echoes, The Relic, Seven, American Psycho, 8mm, Scream, and Candyman might not all have the strongest scripts, but do all share that kind of tactile, textured feel to the styles of their worlds that was just at a peak for me at this level of filmmaking in the 90s, where a great deal of horror was handled with the same gloves used for prestige drama. Tactually, the approach to making these studio films differed in style little from An American Beauty or Good Will Hunting. The difference was merely in their subjects, and that feeling is present here in Carrie 2 as well. It is very competently shot, at times is quite beautiful, and the sets and lighting all have that grounded feel to them that you would expect from something like this of that era. One of the wildest decisions that this movie makes is having Carrie be canon to the Lovecraft mythos, as it is revealed that after the events of the first film, Sue Snell experienced a mental breakdown, and was sent from Maine to be held against her will for a period of time in the asylum in Arkham, Massachusetts. This is mentioned and is quickly skipped over and never addressed again, but was such a funny reference to include that when I watched this it took me out of it for a few minutes. Also, while we're on the subject of her as a character, it doesn't really make a ton of sense that she's in this movie. Sue is the only returning character from the first film, and is a principal now of the high school where she once survived a massacre at, and Rachel is a student at her high school, and the chances of this woman by happenstance being witness to rampages perpetrated by a telekinetic teenager, not once, but twice before she reaches the age of 50, is a very hard stretch. But whatever. Now, it is later revealed that Rachel's mother had an affair with Ralph White, and that she is Carrie's biological half-sister, and that he passed the telepathy gene onto her that way. But that revelation comes late into the film, and this coincidence is fairly distracting for a great deal of the runtime, as they try to build this big mystery as to how Rachel even has these powers. I know that in the novel, Carrie inherited her abilities from her father who had more control over them, but I really don't think that we need an actual explained reason for Rachel to have powers. I highly doubt that anybody saw the original Carrie and said that they couldn't be invested in it because they didn't understand why this girl could do these things. You just accept it. It is the reality that is presented to you. It's like Superman and his nonsense connected to the sun. I don't need to know why this guy can do these things within the context of that kind of narrative. Just tell me that he's strong and that he can fly, and I can jive with that. So mostly I see this subplot as an unneeded distraction that only drags down the film. But the sibling familial connection does add a bit of that weird American Gothic V.C. Andrews undertone that the whole thing is trying to go for. The ruins of the original structure of the high school still sit untouched on the grounds, as some bizarre monument to that night. Rachel's mother is confined to a mental hospital, and it is playing in older genre spaces that the original was not interested in. So while I appreciate some of this, for me, the twist is a mixed bag that adds as much as it takes away. Emily Bergel as Rachel, this film's Carrie White, is really good. We really don't have a bad Carrie performance across the board of this whole franchise, which is important, because each of these films hinge on these young women to carry this heavy narrative. She really delivers here a different flavor of the same type of character that these movies are about. She gives a very kind, very nice, average-looking girl role, who is the type of person who can be easily taken advantage of by hyper-aggressive violent guys in this kind of situation that the film is dealing with. And on top of that, the character is an openly queer student in a 90s high school setting. Her struggle with that is the through line of the film, and only agitates the boys' violence towards her. It is the reason that they single her out, because they think they can fix her. Rachel is the only version of this story that embraces that subtext, which has flavored the entire franchise. And in that, even though it has since its release been a bit made fun of, it actually has a lot going for it, and is very valid in what it is trying to express. It has that same horrible, tragic energy that the first Carrie does, and isn't also at the same time just a rehash of what that movie did, and is talking about another issue of toxic popular boys in school. And I kind of love the movie for that. Instead of a repetition in plot, it is a repetition in theme, of how these are universal issues that span decades and centuries, with the only thing changing being the cultural context of the events. There's not the central theme of blood here, but she is still connected to Carrie in how she is treated, with the recurring signifier of the color red being used to remind us of that. Her bag at school, the towel when she leaves the shower, the streak of color in her hair, her heart tattoo, the dress that she wears at the climactic party, all are callbacks to the connection she shares with that girl, who's representative of all girls who have been mistreated just for being who they are. This is a film about the parallels of trauma throughout time. There is no Carrie in this movie, there is no prom, and yet the ghosts of that night still repeat and haunt these people, which builds to this horrible climax, where all of this internalized anguish that Rachel feels is blasted out at those who perpetrate or reinforce and enable this kind of behavior. This sequence is honestly pretty great, including a 90s electronica dance beat that samples Piper Laurie yelling, "They're all gonna laugh at you." It is exceptionally violent, by far taking its ending rampage further than any of the other entries are willing to go. It is excessive, but is so to demonstrate the unintended collateral damage of a path of violence like this. In her rage, she throws a fire poker through the head of her only real friend. All are guilty here. And as an actor and performer, she sadly went through a bit of hell during this production as well. From what I've read, the party set where the rampage was filmed on was built too small to be safe for a lot of the extensive effect shots that they wanted. In filming this shot, for instance, the glass exploding was a real sheet of actual glass. They had to shoot it 3 times to get a take where she didn't react to it breaking, and on each one, she received cuts all over her body from the shrapnel of it exploding. They actually had to film the rest of this sequence differently than they had planned, to hide her injuries from showing up on camera, which is why she stands with her back to the wall for the entire sequence and never moves. If just looking at it thematically overall, as a work, I think this is a film that has been unfairly treated in the past few decades. Even though it started originally as its own standalone project, it ended up being maybe my second favorite in the Carrie franchise. It is at least the one that is the most compelling in what it does and how it stretches what a Carrie film can be, and I think deserves a bit of a cultural reassessment for what it was trying, as it really does build a careful narrative that I really appreciate, which is ultimately ruined by a final scene that closes on one of the worst looking jump scares of all time. Which brings us to the 2002 readaptation of the novel. I think one of the most damning things that you can say about this movie is that it is a full 34 minutes longer than the original, and yet does everything worse, and is not as entertaining. That's not to say that it's bad, mind you. In fact, it is a fairly competent movie, and on its own merit is pretty enjoyable, even though it drags in a great deal of its scenes, and could have used some extensive trimming. It actually is the Carrie adaptation I appreciate the most behind the original, but the nature of its quality isn't the main thing to discuss here, as the question is there on if this should have even been made in the first place, when the first one was so culturally respected and well done. It is largely irrelevant, not necessary to exist, which could be said about all art but is especially true here. If you're going to try and remake one of the best films of all time, you've got to come out swinging or go about it in a radically different approach, which is the option they go with here. Instead of utilizing the non-stop kinetic intensity of De Palma's film, with his camera that never stays still for more than a second or two, they're instead going for that similar daytime prestige V.C. Andrews 90s made-for-TV gothic flair that Carrie 2 was also reminiscent of, complete with slow melodic piano score and Dutch angles for days. Everything that they're doing here feels self-conscious, naked, making decisions to try to not be compared to De Palma, instead of for their own artistic interpretation of how this story should be visually presented. Where he went dark and moody, they went overlit and undersaturated. Which is funny considering that one of the first professional contacts that Victor Gross had in the film industry, who served as cinematographer for this, was Mario Tozzi, the cinematographer for the first Carrie. Where De Palma gave us scenes at a breakneck, emotionally brutal pace, they slow things down and let the characters marinate in this world. But even with the added screen time, it ends up to little avail. These characters feel much more one-dimensional than they did in their 76 counterpart. But really, I don't know if that's a fair thing to say. Anything compared to that movie would fail. Nothing that they could do stylistically could be more impactful than that original work. To that end, the De Palma film is perfect. So I think more so this should be critiqued on a narrative level, rather than a stylistic, filmic one, because that is the only path to doing great things with this property that they had. You could have a worthwhile conversation comparing this with Mick Garris's 90s Shining remake, which similarly was much more faithful to the source material than its respective, more critically recognized first film. A conversation on the question of adaptation, of if adhering religiously and devotedly to a source makes that work better, or if artistic liberties in transitioning mediums is a more appropriate method. A question on why or if these films should be made. Essentially everything from the Carrie novel is on screen here, mostly. Flashbacks, dialogue, it is the novel in film format, in the most pure way that we have ever received. It is updated. Carrie does her paranormal research on a big early 2000s computer with dial-up internet, instead of through encyclopedias like she does in the original. She is cast to look more like Spacek than how she is described in the book, but on a narrative level, very little is changed. It even adapts things from the novel that probably shouldn't have been there in the first place. Things that a more competent editor may have excised or rearranged. This is the only version to depict the scene from Carrie's childhood, where she gets upset and uses her uncontrolled powers to make it hail huge stones of ice onto her mother's house. This was in the book to set up and mirror King's original intentions with the ending, which were, let's say, less subtle. He had in his mind an image of Carrie, who has grown horns with the birth of her full powers. And with her rampage through the streets, she was going to bring down planes and full meteorites to destroy the buildings within the town. Very Book of Revelation kind of final act, a full-blown biblical apocalyptic event. This still does happen in the book, but was edited to be much more toned down with how he originally depicted it. Like I said, despite being an extremely faithful adaptation, the film does drag. Part of the reason that this feels slow is that they even added new material for this, not because they felt that it would help the story, but instead because they were forced into doing so. Contractually, they had agreed to deliver a movie that was at least 130 minutes long, and after adapting the novel as faithfully as possible, they ended up being short on that runtime, and had to go back and film some new filler scenes to bump that runtime up, which does harm the overall experience, but also gives us some added character moments that occasionally work, even if they are not entirely needed. It has to be said that Angela Bettis nails the role of Carrie, and her performance is easily the best thing about this movie. She has continued to work since then, but seems to have had a bit of a struggling acting career, as she mainly appears in relatively obscure projects, and frequently as supporting characters in those projects. Which is a real shame because she genuinely is great here and kills this role. Like everything here, she's going for a distinctly anti-De Palma take, but it really works. She goes for more of a depressed teenager vibe than the almost alien take that the first film had. De Palma's Carrie feels so detached from the rest of the world that she exists in, that she almost feels as if she is a different species trying to fit in and not be noticed. Whereas here they're serving a much more realistic depiction of what your average high school outcast may be like. She was of a similar age at the time of filming this, as Sissy Spacek was when she gave her rendition of the character. Both were nearing 30, and the argument could be made that a younger person should be playing this character. I mean, Bettis was even alive when the '76 film was released. But she does deliver a real emotional depth that grounds this version of the story in a very different, and I think appropriate, approach. In every scene, she has these deep bags under her eyes that are extremely unnerving for a character her age. Just that alone conveys the sleepless trauma and false religious guilt that she is weighed down with. And if you told me that Bettis stayed up all night before each day that she had to shoot, I would absolutely believe you. It's the kind of energy that really is compelling for a character. And when you see her, you are immediately reminded of someone you knew in high school, who similarly seemed to be in a constant state of internal struggle because of their tumultuous home life. The rest of the cast are good too, but are nothing to write home about. This is the film that Emily DeRaven learned how to do an American accent for, and would lead to her success outside of Australia, eventually landing her a starring role on Lost. This is the entry in the franchise, though, where it is most evident that these are not high school-aged actors. All of these people look 30, and it comes across as occasionally bizarre. Mrs. Desjardins in her scenes looks to be the same age as her students. If you were to watch it on mute, you may assume that she is intended to be a fellow high schooler. Patricia Clarkson is kind of the worst in this, but anyone would look bad standing in Piper Laurie's shadow. That performance is such an all-time great that it alone could be the argument of why a Carrie adaptation should not be attempted. Clarkson is normally great, I have nothing against her, but she gets entirely swallowed in this role. She's floundering in most of her scenes and it's a bit hard to watch. It screams local theater production. But I imagine that Margaret is the type of role that only particular character actors like Ann Dowd excel at, which are deceptively difficult to make believable in how much that you hate them. She's also a character that has always been represented by the space in which she appears. The layout of her home is almost the exact same as it was in that original adaptation, which I'm a bit torn on. Their house feels so distinctly 70s compared to everything in the film, but it works to distinguish Carrie's home life from the modern world outside. There's a somewhat good juxtaposition there. These people are not adjusted. They are not normal, and their environment reflects that. I've been in many Christian fundamentalist homes, and they all kind of have that timeless, wooden feel to their decor. To me, the original Carrie is one of the most emotionally difficult movies ever made. The downfall of watching her climb to the stage set to that music, with that framing, is devastating to me every single time. And they tried to play within that space here, and the bits that they do pull it off hit hard. Watching Carrie in the department store trying on makeup, slowly falling into the trap of going against her base instinct, and believing that these girls aren't pulling some cruel ruse over her, and might actually like her, might actually see the value that she has. Believing for the first time in her life that she is really worthy of love, that she might have a place in this world after all, that she isn't worthless, that there indeed may be hope, that people might actually like her for who she is, although, in reality, they never did, and just saw her as some sad thing that they could play with because they were bored. The final cruelty being that after the deaths and the fires, the police inspector finds Carrie's yearbook, flipping through it to discover that not a single person signed hers. It to me is the saddest moment in any of these movies. This was produced as a made-for-television film for NBC and aired on November 4th of 2002, and for a made-for-TV movie, they actually really do push the boundaries of acceptability for that medium. It doesn't push it quite like Carrie 2 did, but it does still go there. Network television had since the early to mid-90s tested what they could get away with, and this isn't even the only time that NBC ran this kind of experiment of intense violence with a Brian Fuller show. But I do appreciate that they don't shy away from some of the more explicit details of Carrie's story. This obviously isn't the gritty, neon-soaked revenge film that De Palma made. It never delivers quite as cruel a visual as a tombstone, with the words, "Carrie White burns in hell," but in its own way tells the story well, with a lesser but still appropriate level of violence. That is the motif of the story, after all. In addition to this, with Fuller's involvement as screenwriter, there's a further exploration of the inherent queerness associated with being an outsider in Carrie's story, more than arguably any other adaptation, and even more than King's original novel. I love King, but a criticism that one could consistently make against him and his work, one that he is usually given a pass on, is that any time that there could be a queer viewpoint in his writing, his artistic inclination is either to veer in the exact opposite way and ignore the subtext, or kill them quickly and violently after some heavy uses of slurs. The same thing could be said about him with race as well, but it also was the 70s and 80s, and the country was in a very different place as far as those standards are concerned. Not that that excuses it. King is a straight white guy, and he typically stays within that comfort zone in his writing, which isn't a slight against him at all, but it is an undeniable fact. Stick with what you know, I guess. And this is probably for good measure, because when he does dip his toe into this, at least to me, as evident by some of his black characters, he comes across as relying more on 1800s levels of stereotypes in really negative, non-critical ways, particularly in their dialect, as compared to how he would write white characters in similar situations. Detta in The Drawing of the Three and Mother Abigail in The Stand are characters that are really difficult to excuse on a narrative level. Anytime that queerness is read into his work, it is typically done in a lens that was not probably intended on his part as the author, or is more so associated with an adaptation of his work that fleshes out an aspect that might have been hinted at in King's novel, or invented entirely for the adaptation specifically. Carrie has historically been taken into the canon as a staple of queer horror films. A lot of the creatives involved with the many adaptations were queer. The iconography is often lifted for other queer media. And in keeping with tradition, Fuller lends a voice to that, with an added subtext focusing on that aspect of the narrative. The interactions between the hyper-masculine bullies have a certain domination charge to them. The casual confrontation and flirtation between a few others later in the prom scene has a similar energy to the point where even their girlfriends accuse them of being gay, because they are giving each other more attention than they are to their dates. A further queer undercurrent of criticism against religion is in this, that differs a bit from the other adaptations. At one point, Carrie's mother off the cuff quotes a verse from Ezekiel at her, as defense of her harsh actions. But if you look it up, the verse that she quotes doesn't exist. She just makes it up, because she's using the Bible as a shield for her petty nature. There's another great bit, where she says that she is worried that Carrie has sinned so much that Jesus will no longer love her. A complete contradiction of the base teachings of the religion, and a defense, or projection, of her own love for her daughter being conditional. As they say, there's no such hate as Christian love. Many queer kids grow up in fundamentalist homes, and Fuller is leaning hard into that in this script. It's a shame that the production values were not the best on this, leading to its failure, because under the hood, it is playing with some really smart ideas of what a Carrie adaptation should or could be. But I guess that's also very in line with queer media history, as our movies with similarly important ideas have historically been poorly produced on a technical level, leaving them to only be, for the most part, underground cult hits. There is another additional added layer here, of Sue being accused of being a lesbian by the other popular girls for showing empathy to Carrie, and for asking her boyfriend Tommy to take her to the prom. And this is a great line of thinking because it is very high school minded. He is great at tapping into that well, and brings the story into that modern high school drama style, which did not quite exist when the original was created. That work helped to formulate the genre, while this one conforms to its strengths. As other shows saturated in high school tropes were quite popular on other cable channels at the time. I also think it was very smart to cast Candace McClure as Sue for this, and recontextualizing that character to being black. She is a part of the popular girls. She's accepted within their circle, but she too understands what it means to be an outsider. She is always at the edge of their group. She is a part of them, yes, but also will always be treated slightly differently than they are. And the second that she does something that they do not agree with, she is essentially socially exiled. Their acceptance of her was conditional, to only being given when she acted within their set boundaries. The moment that she acts for herself is the same moment that they can no longer tolerate her. It makes her empathy for Carrie more impactful and nuanced. Even though she has status and is popular within the system that she exists in, she knows what it's like to be othered by people on a daily basis. And I would say this is the best version of the character for that reason. In other adaptations, including the original novel, Sue is just the nice one who pities Carrie, and it kinda stops there. She's always been a little bit one-dimensional, and lacking strong motivation other than her base humanity. But here she has a deeper, unstated, but still understood reason for her actions within the story. Another thing that Fuller adds to this, for better or worse depending on your personal preference, is his own brand of snappy, self-aware dialogue that has become synonymous to that high school drama subgenre. It is mixed in with lines from the source text, but you can feel his own distinctive fingerprints all over this thing, especially in the new scenes that were written to pad out the runtime. This was being created in a post-Scream world. A good deal of mainstream horror output had meta aspects, and were self-aware for a few years there. And he brings a touch of that to this. When Sue Snell is asking Tommy to take Carrie to the prom, he asks her if he got that idea from that one Freddie Prinze Jr. movie. He is referring to 1999's She's All That, which was built off the success of Pretty Woman earlier that decade, a modern retelling of 1956's My Fair Lady, which itself was based on 1913's Pygmalion, which in turn was inspired by the Greek myth of the same name. The film is about a group of mean-spirited high school jocks who makes a bet that one of them can't turn an unpopular girl into being a prom queen in a short amount of time. Tommy, within this movie, is commenting on this trope within other movies, these layers of story that Carrie is certainly a part of the tradition of. He says, "But in that film, she's played by a supermodel, and we aren't supposed to know that because she's wearing glasses or something." His character comes this close to the point of being self-aware that he himself is a player within a film, that he knows the rules of this game and how this will turn out, which is his reasoning for being apprehensive to her plan. The final big show at the prom is a little disappointing. Carrie walking to the stage, both in the book and the 76 version, are devastating. Here we get a long, dragged-out sequence set to classical music. We see Carrie get to momentarily celebrate her queenhood before it's taken away from her. I get what they're going for, but it lacks all tension. It lacks that dread of impending doom. She doesn't feel like an unsuspecting cow being led to the slaughter, which is what this sequence is intended to evoke the emotions of. And then when things finally do go wrong, we are treated to some 2002 television CGI flying tables that calls to mind a Disney Channel Halloween special. The poor CGI also leads to by far the funniest, overly dramatic car crash in the series. And at the end of the movie, when Margaret has her heart attack, we go full PS2 cinematic mode and zoom into her chest cavity so we can watch it happen inside of her. They just went full ham with the computer stuff in the last 20 minutes. You know, The worst part about this is the film actually has a pretty striking poster, with the red dress and deeply saturated blacks of the shadows cast upon her. It gives you a certain expectation going into it, that the finale fails to live up to. But like, a quarter of the shots in this sequence are well done, which unfortunately only makes the ones that don't work all the more glaring. There is one final thing that should be said about this ending, which is one of those great what-if scenarios of film history. This adaptation famously changes the ending of the story, where now instead of dying, Sue Snell fakes Carrie's death, and smuggles her to Florida to start a new life under a new identity. And this was done specifically as an attempt by Fuller to leverage a new TV show out of this movie, as it was his intention in writing it, that if he could make it work, he would have done a Carrie TV show about her traveling the country under a new identity in episodic fashion, finding other people with psychic abilities, and helping them understand how to control them, so that they too won't have a rampage like she did. It would have been a bit of a redemption story for Carrie, as she rebuilds herself after her revenge, and is honestly kind of a fascinating idea, I think. A meditation on queer chosen families, on redemption, growth. It could have genuinely been a great hypothetical work. Angela Bettis said on the potential show, "The ideas I've heard are Carrie and Sue Snell taking off for Florida, like Thelma and Louise. I've heard something else about how the town reacts to this great catastrophe, like what happened after Columbine. Here's this girl dealing with her psychokinesis, and the fact that she wiped out an entire town of people. But sadly, the movie didn't perform as intended. It had bad reviews and ratings, so this never came to be, and remains a mystery as to how things would have turned out." Then, only 11 years later, in 2013, we received a new adaptation. This movie has a bad reputation, and if the other adaptations did not exist, and this existed in a vacuum unto itself, I think its reception would have probably been a lot kinder. It's not great, but like all adaptations of this story, it does some really unique things. This is the only adaptation that uses actual children as actors for these characters. Chloe Grace Moretz was only 15 at the time, and that adds a grounded feel to the world of this film. This aspect does have its downsides, however, as since they could only work 8 hours a day, the adults frequently filmed their scenes after the child actors were done, which is why they are frequently filmed in shots standing by themselves, because they were on set acting alone. It's not something that you consciously recognize when watching it, but at times there are just a few things off about these characters, who are supposed to be interacting with each other. Test audiences unfortunately did as they often do and somewhat ruined what this movie could be. I used to work in market research running focus groups for movies, and I can tell you firsthand that those things are essentially useless all of the time, and are generally actively harmful to the filmmaking process. I was extremely depressed every day that I worked there, because I felt like I was making every movie that I ran focus groups for worse. Every day brought some form of fresh insanity. One example I will always remember is that back when Jurassic World came out, I was told to show a few rough cuts of scenes to a test audience before any of the CGI was completed. One of which was the first sequence when Chris Pratt interacts with the raptors for the first time. And the version that I showed those people just had Chris Pratt in this pit, reacting and talking to nothing. Just thin, empty air. What useful information could you possibly get from a test audience that early in the process? They of course gave the scene a bad review. In the case of this movie, it was filmed under the intentions of being a lot more in line with the original novel, but those focus groups didn't like how different it was from the 1976 version that they were familiar with. So the studio ordered reshoots for entire sections of this, to re-edit it and reframe it, to be more of a remake of the 76 movie rather than a new adaptation, making the vision for this project null and now redundant. The original release date was intended to be March 15th of 2013, but due to these reshoots it wouldn't hit theaters until Halloween of that year. There are signs that this could have ended up being a great film in the development stage. It was directed by Kimberly Pierce of Boys Don't Cry fame. Believe it or not, it is also co-written by Lawrence D. Cohen, who definitely understands the story of Carrie, because at this point he's written 3 out of the 4 produced adaptations. He's also someone who is at least a big fan of King, and arguably understands what makes a King story work, as he wrote other King adaptations for the screen with the 90s It, the Tommyknockers, as well as an episode of Nightmares and Dreamscapes. He also co-wrote Ghost Story, that we've covered here in the past. I think one of the big writing-on-the-wall moments is that this is also co-written by Roberto Acquire Sacasa, a television writer-for-hire who has worked on episodes of Glee, Supergirl, Pretty Little Liars Original Sin, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and Riverdale, where he surprisingly did not do the famous Carrie the Musical episode. And say what you will about those shows, but they do across the board all have a certain self-aware camp aesthetic to their dialogue that has overtaken a lot of the modern high school media. And while the possibility is there to do this through that modern post-2010 high school dramedy show lens, it's not something that lends itself well to Carrie in my opinion, because as a story it only functions when there's an earnestness about it, a supreme and honest cruelty in the filmmaking. The original Carrie is very camp. Everything about it is extremely pageantary. But there's a stern groundedness to it that makes that work. And that self-aware Glee style of modern camp writing isn't what this story of pain and revenge was designed for. Margaret White can't wink at the camera while she's being over-the-top extra. It ruins the effect. Not that this film is going full-on Glee, but the fingerprints of that show's impact on the subgenre can be felt at times throughout. Another similar issue here that really plagues this movie is that Hollywood has developed a problem of holding a firm grasp onto beauty above all else. And this obviously has always been a thing within film. You've only got to look at how impossibly perfect Rita Hayworth's hair is in The Lady from Shanghai to see that. A part of depiction within art is idealization, after all. But the 70s and 80s thrived on unconventional-looking character actors, playing side characters that looked like everyday folk, mixed in with the conventionally attractive main performers. But today, different or funny-looking people are not allowed to exist in film anymore. If you have a heavy-set character, they will be played by a conventionally attractive person in a fat suit, doing their best caricature of a fat person. Normal people aren't even allowed to exist anymore. Mainstream Hollywood has to a degree become an institution that hates looking at the average human. It is something that is repulsed by the idea of actually reflecting reality within art. Even nature has to be digitally enhanced to be perfect, orderly, pristine, and designed. It's no longer good enough to just go shoot in the woods anymore. This beauty above character is constantly found in instances where it doesn't make sense to be there, especially within genre film. I've always hated that a character will go through the worst thing that has ever happened to them. They may get covered in grime, dirt, blood, or other horrible things, but their face will always be perfectly clean except for maybe one delicately placed scratch, or, if we're pushing the envelope, they may have some blood at the top of their forehead or the edge of their cheek. But only a few drops and never on the front of the face itself. Let's not get too crazy here. I understand that they're paying for big names, and more importantly, the pretty faces attached to those big names. And they don't want to have that money hidden behind a thick layer of muck. Or, as is often the case, the performer doesn't want their face hidden by that grime. But as a viewer, it is always extremely distracting to me, and I love how movies like Mandy will actually be daring in its creative decisions. And hire Nicolas Cage, and then not be afraid to absolutely cover his face up with gore for a lot of the runtime. You can still see this as Cage. He can absolutely emote through this, but you have the added element of his primal rampage to enhance what he's doing. When she was cast in the Book of Eli, Mila Kunis wanted them to make her a fake set of teeth that gave the appearance they were rotting and yellowed, like, you know, how they would look if you grew up in a wasteland apocalypse. But they said no, because they weren't going to pay a 2010 Mila Kunis level salary, only to hide what they perceived made her worth hiring. It isn't her acting that they wanted, it wasn't her ability to conjure a character, they were buying her body.
Around 15, 16 is when everything changed for me. That's when I started to realize, oh, I'm not just an actor. I'm viewed as an actress.
In last year's Uma, I thought the character of Chrissy was mishandled completely from the writing, all the way to the performance and visual depiction of her as a person. She's one of the worst characters that I've seen in a new film in a long time, really. She's raised by her mother, who is her only friend, and has been forced to stay within the confines of their home and farm that they work on for her entire life. She has no real grasp on the outside world, except for mere abstract concepts. She is hidden away from society. She has never been to school. She's never done anything at all that we would consider a normal part of growing up in America. She has only known two people her entire life, her mother and her mother's handyman. They have no television. They don't even have electricity, because her mother is mentally ill and claims to be allergic to it. They are cut off entirely in every way imaginable, and this is the only reality that Chrissy has ever known. But despite this, she acts, looks, speaks, and reflects the idealization of an American teenager. There's a dissonance here, a disconnect between the theme of the movie and the need for beauty in all instances. The story is about her mother holding her back, just like her grandmother had done before her. It is a story of generational trauma, of being emotionally stunted by a horrible childhood, not unlike the story of Carrie. But at one point in the movie, Chrissy says the words "psycho bitch" to her mom. Where did she learn that? Where did she get that kind of vocabulary? We're talking about someone who's never seen an episode of television or a movie. The film makes no effort to explain any of this. We get one scene where she's reading a book with her mother, and we can presume that she knows some about the outside world through her books. But this is a 30-second scene, and to read this much out of it is a bit of a stretch, because the intent of the scene is to show that even though she's a captive of her mother, that she is still close with her and feels love for her at the same time. She shouldn't look like this, she shouldn't be presentable or know how to talk or act around traditionally socialized people. But this is a film, and a film needs beauty, and so even if it doesn't make any sense, we have Fievel Stewart here wearing form-fitting clothing, because of a need to not show things as they are or would be in this actual scenario. And this can be found across all modern horror. In this year's Scream, Sam gets a soda thrown on her shirt early in the movie, but in the next scene there's no stain on it, because that would not be beautiful. In Look Away, India Isley's character is constantly called ugly and tired. There's a whole scene that is so off base that it just becomes funny, where her father makes her go upstairs to put on makeup because she's so unsightly. There's a sequence later in the movie where her family encourages her to get cosmetic surgery because she's so insecure in how she looks. But in casting India Isley in that role, all this is rendered bizarre, as it almost comes across as comical because of how objectively classically pretty that she is. And modern Carrie is no different. Hands down for this film, Chloe Grace Moretz has got to be historically one of the most miscast actors for any character, maybe ever. Even the poster for this movie, with her traditional model look, mouth half open, face covered in blood, is trying to sell tickets on sex appeal. This is not a mark against her or her performance in any way. In fact, I do actually quite like her in films. But let's face it, Moretz has modeled for Vogue, Elle, and Crash. She is a regular at Paris Fashion Week. She has won international style awards. She's been listed in publications as being among the most beautiful women in the world. She grew up with an extremely wealthy family in New York City. Her father owned a famous women's clothing business that he sold in 2011 for $350 million. She's stunning. She comes from money, and she looks it. And that is the antithesis of Carrie. Moretz is a queer woman, and that was probably one of the aspects at play that drew her to this kind of role. But to me, inner queerness and a sense of being different to those around you is only half of what makes a good Carrie. She also has to look different. This is an uncomfortable thing to say, but Carrie is in part an exploration of what it is like to be someone that society deems to be visibly ugly, to be someone who does not possess traditional beauty. It is a meditation on the unattractive, the unpopular, the unfit, the unwanted, the outsider, as determined by the unlikable rich white popular kids at the school. The high school setting in fiction functions as a microcosmic symbolic location of the country or our society at large. There's a reason that high school stories are popular in all art forms, and it's because they can all act like this. It is one of the only locations in life where all types of people, no matter their background, are forced to be in the same place at the same time and interact with each other as supposed equals. Here, the teachers are politicians, who can scold but really hold no actual tangible power over those that come from money, who can do whatever they want because their parents have actual power and influence through their wealth, which translates to them having power within this setting. Most people here are just background elements, trying to get by except for the few who get the attention of the rich kids, and have the hardest time as a result of their vindictiveness born from the day-to-day ennui of existing within this prison. I know this isn't the best thing to say, but in reality, even if she had the worst personality on the planet and was poor on top of that, Chloe Grace Moretz would be at least to some degree popular in a high school setting, no matter what. She might not be the most well-liked girl in school. There would be some who picked on her, but she certainly would be no Carrie. And that is a pervasive feeling that lasts from beginning to end in this film. You never quite get it out of the back of your head. Stephen King personally suggested the inspired choice of casting Lindsay Lohan, which would have been at least an interesting move, a commentary on where she was in her career, as well as paralleling Mean Girls the decade previous. But by this point, she would have been too old for that, and this is the movie we ended up with. And honestly, it is a mostly serviceable adaptation of Carrie for a new generation that more or less works and is fun, if not a little bit too by the books and safe in most departments. This is one of the most faithful adaptations of the novel, but it is also the one that I have the least to say about. One of the elements that works the best with this is that it brings it into the modern world. In the opening shower scene, someone films the incident on their phone, and then the video gets passed around on social media, so that by the end of the day, everyone in the school has basically been present for her hazing. A second non-stop repeating digital humiliation that exists only in this new internet world. This builds to an even more cruel moment of humiliation, as the video is projected onto the screen during her prom queen catastrophe. And this is a great idea, and makes the film feel not so 70s, which is an issue in all the other entries. With this modernization, it also is the only adaptation to feature actual prom music during the prom sections, with modern top 40 poppy dance hits playing throughout that sequence, which gives it its own unique feel that separates it apart from the other adaptations, that all seem as if they're trying to recapture how the original did this scene. Carrie's rampage, similarly, is filmed really well and is a lot of fun, and has the only good car flipping scene in the entire franchise. This is included in every single adaptation, and I would argue that this take on it is the only one that actually works. The first one is memorable, but I also think that it misses the mark a bit compared to how good the rest of the movie is. But beyond this, what else is there to say about this film that isn't done better in any other adaptation? While I like it, we have by this point reached a time where these movies are having less and less of a point of existing each time around. At least Dracula stories are usually telling original tales that happen to share the same titular character. We are here a decade later, and outside of the Carrie episode of Riverdale in 2018, we haven't had any new media in the franchise, which is probably a good thing. In 2019, it was reported by Collider that FX was developing a miniseries based on the book, to adapt it again. But nothing has been said on it since, and I imagine the pandemic ruined any plans that they had for that project. What new thing could be said with this property that has not yet been said time and time again? Any new addition to this conversation risks the high chance of repetition with a hollow voice. I'm sure that one day we will probably get yet another version of this story, and when that day comes, I hope it is a radical departure from the novel. We don't ever need another adaptation of that book. It should have never become one of those stories that we constantly retell every 10 years or so. And at least for a while, I'm glad to see that we've put this to rest. But if they do revisit it again, they should take those themes of what it means to examine the unwanted, to examine the misfit, to give the ability of unimaginable revenge to someone who is normally viewed as weak, as dispensable, as powerless. And I think you might have something there.
Oh, how awful hell must be. Turn away, Jesus, and soon you shall see. With fire to torment you and memories to haunt, and never receiving the things that you want. Oh, how awful hell must be. And after 10,000 years of suffering and thirst, no less time awaits you than there was at the first. Oh, how awful hell must be. How terrible are the sounds from that awful place. Forsaken of God, forsaken of His mercy, forsaken of grace. For there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, screaming and crying, but never